the last week of the life of Jesus of Nazareth, when he rode into the city of Jerusalem, was executed on a Roman cross, was buried, but then returned from the dead, is the most important week in the whole of his life. It's at the heart and centre of the whole Bible, and in fact, it's at the centre, that week is at the centre of the history of the world. And we celebrate that at Easter. My name's Stuart Kimber, and I'm going to introduce you to the backstory of that week. What lies behind that week, Jesus told us. Because after he'd risen from the dead, and as he was about to send all his disciples out to go and tell the world about him, this is what the Gospel of Luke says that he did. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets and the Psalms. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. So it's the whole Bible that is the backstory of the life and message of Jesus. And we're going to go through that whole Bible, and in 6 short videos, we're going to sprint through the Old Testament, and we're going to do a slightly more leisurely jog through the New Testament using this little booklet I've written called Sprinting with God and Jogging with Jesus. And in that little booklet, here is a little introduction to the whole Bible. The Christian Bible is a unique collection of 66 books containing work from some 40 authors who wrote over a period of about 1,500 years in 3 languages. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew, with a few short passages in Aramaic, and the New Testament is written in Greek. It contains a wide range of well-known and less well-known literary forms: history, law, wisdom, poetry, songs, letters, prophecy, apocalyptic, that's a mixture of poetry and images and prose, and parables, illustrative stories, and gospels, a kind of biography. The Bible mentions thousands of people, some 2,600 of them by name. In English, it contains 775,000 words. It's shorter than the Harry Potter books, and about 22% longer than War and Peace, a great big massive novel by Tolstoy. The average reader would take 3.5 days to read it in one sitting, or 5.5 days if they slept at night. And yet, despite its relatively small size and its incredibly varied contents and contributors, it conveys a clear, consistent and understandable message. Christians believe that God has chosen to reveal his character and purposes to us through the interface of the Bible. But we're helped to engage with it properly by being given a few advanced pointers, taken from the Bible's own account of itself, so that our first hesitant steps into the Bible don't set us on the wrong track, and so that we take the right pathway into it right from the start. The man who first translated the Bible into English, called William Tyndale, he knew that we needed a bit of help, and he wrote a preface to that translation for a whole country who had never read the Bible in their own language. Well, I've written a little booklet to introduce us in a similar way. And we're going to start with the Old Testament. Sprinting with God, because this is where we meet God. And if you were to take your Bible, and if you were to stick your fingers in it like this, put your ring finger in at the beginning of the book of Genesis, put your middle finger in at the beginning of the book of Job, put your index finger in at the beginning of the book of Isaiah, and if you were to put your thumb in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you would have, there we are, the 3 sections of the Old Testament. And in this first section here is all the story, all the history in the Old Testament. And some people might think, easy to make the mistake, that the Old Testament is just the story of God at work in the world from beginning to end. But no, all the story is there in that part. And in the other two parts, there is the prophets, which are people who spoke into the life of God's people as he worked amongst them. And there were wise people who wrote about their experience of God. And that's in the wisdom books that's in the middle. But that is the whole story. And it begins with the book of Genesis. It famously begins with the book of Genesis. And it starts with the creation. It simply describes that God famously starts the beginning. In the beginning, God created the universe. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. And, you know, the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis are the most important books, the most important chapters in the Bible, probably, because they tell us why the world is the way it is. Begins with God creating the world. He created Adam and Eve, the first human beings, and he gave it to them. And he said, you can have it all. It's for you and for me together. Just one thing, he said, don't do that. So typically human beings, they did that. They made the wrong choice. And from then on, everything went pear-shaped between them and God. Their first two sons, one of them murdered the other, Cain and Abel. Then things got so bad and people behaved so badly that God was sorry that he created human beings, because we're told in Genesis 1 to 11, he could see that there was only evil in human hearts all day long. And so he did that other famous thing that we read of in these chapters. He wiped the whole of life out with a flood. He chose Noah, a man, and his family, who were more godly than anybody else on the earth. And he said, we'll start again. Let's see if we can start again. So with Noah, he started again. And when there was only Noah and his family, things started to go pear-shaped again. Noah was a good bloke, but things went pear-shaped again. They went downhill. But God had promised Noah that he would never wipe human beings out again. He'd never wipe out life on earth again. He was never going to walk away again. But by the time you get to chapter 11 of Genesis, the human race has gone hopelessly wrong again. And this time they want to build a big tower called the Tower of Babel. It's called in the Bible. Build a big tower, go up to God, sort him out once and for all. They wanted to make a name for themselves. So God had to stop that again, and he had to start again. But he didn't, as he promised, wipe everybody out. He confused everybody's language and scattered them across the whole planet. And so they couldn't get any worse for a while. And then, in Genesis chapter 12, he starts his huge plan for how he was going to never walk away and how he was going to speak into the human race. So in Genesis chapter 12, we have, the whole Bible, but especially the Old Testament, it's not just a history. It's not just a load of laws. It's not just about God. It's a love letter from God to the human race. It's not a romantic love letter saying, oh, I love you, darling, and here are some flowers. It's not that kind of love. It's a love letter of commitment. A letter that says, I love you, and I will love you forever, and I will never leave you, and I'll never walk away. And in chapter 12 of Genesis, God begins to say this, and he says it to a man called Abraham. Again, he starts with one man and his family, and this is what he says to Abraham. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I'll show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. All nations, it says, will be blessed through you and the nation that your family will become. The most remarkable thing about that is not that Abraham heard God speaking to him. It's what God said to him. He said he was going to bless all the nations of the earth through this man and his descendants. The idea that God should confide in a man what he was going to do, not just in his life, not just in Abraham's life, not just in his family, but what he was going to do down the centuries, is remarkable. He's a God who was going to be committed to Abraham and all people from here on in. Amazing that God should be a God like that. So he speaks to him and he tells him, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And the rest of the book of Genesis is the story of Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and his son Joseph. It's a family saga. It's gripping stuff. Some of the time they're good. A lot of the time they're bad. They make bad choices. But God sticks with them all the way through. And it's just the story of a family. A little later in Genesis chapter 15, verses 12 to 16, God speaks to Abraham again. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, that they will be enslaved and ill-treated there, but I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they'll come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. This is a key word from God about something that worries people about the Old Testament. In fact, horrifies them about the Old Testament. Because God is telling Abraham he's going to give him a land which has already got people in it. And a little later we'll find that God says to drive out those people and kill them. Well, he says here, those people, it'll be 4 generations, 300 years before God is going to go and do that, because God hasn't finished with those people yet. All through the Old Testament you find that God is talking to his own people, but he's also indicating that he's at work in the lives of other nations as well. And by the time he has 300 years of patience with that nation, their sin and despicable lifestyle had not got so bad yet that he needed to destroy them. But he was going to do it when he took Abraham's family into that land to give them the land. And of course the story of how God gave his people the land of Israel is what all this story is about. So that's God talking to Abraham a second time. And the story from Exodus, what God told Abraham came true. His family did end up as slaves in the land of Egypt. They went there first of all because there was a famine and they were kept safe there. But they then became slaves there. And God led them out in the book of Exodus. The word Exodus means coming out. And God, through a man called Moses, led the people out of that slavery. And eventually, we read all the way the story from Exodus, Leviticus, and the book of Numbers tells us how they travelled from Egypt back to that land that God said that he would give Abraham and his descendants. And on the way, he did something else. He gave them the law. His law. Now, something else about the Old Testament people don't like. Isn't God a bossy God with all these laws? Don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other. Twice we're told the 10 Commandments, which sum up God's law. And they're not just rules for behaviour. They're an expression of the character of God, the kind of God he is. And also, if we read why he gave this law, what this law is for, in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 1 to 9, we discover something remarkable. These are the commands. He's just given the law. He just Moses had just told them about the Ten Commandments again. These are the commands, decrees and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, their children after them, may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands, so that you may enjoy long life. Following these laws is a blessing to a community of people if they're followed. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. To follow these laws is to live a wonderful life. That's why God gave the laws. But there's more. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home. They are to be with you always. And the reason for them, so that you could love God. That's why the Bible is a love letter from God to the world. He's always talking, not about do this, do that, do the other. He is always saying, love me. I love you. Love me. And of course, Jesus famously quoted from that when he was asked, what's the most important law? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, and your strength. You see what sort of a God is showing himself here? He's a God who is passionately in love with us. He's made us to live a loving relationship with him. In fact, that man William Tyndale, who translated the Bible into English for the first time, in his little introduction, his preface to the Bible, he said the law, whose minister is Moses, was given to bring us into the knowledge of ourselves, that we might thereby feel and perceive who we really are by nature. We're hopelessly flawed and sinful. Things go pear-shaped whenever we're left to ourselves. But God wants us to love him. He loves us. He wants us to love him. That's who we are. We're created to be loved by God and to love him in return. And the story of the first 5 books of the Bible tells us that. But then the story moves on, and they go into this land that God had promised Abraham all those many years ago. And if we read what God says, what happens at the beginning of the book of Joshua, this is what happens. Here it is, Joshua chapter 1 and verses 1 to 9. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the river Jordan into the land I'm about to give to them. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. And God says again and again, I will be with you always. Here's why. This is a love letter from God to the world. If I read you a selection of things God says all the way through the Bible, from start to finish, from my larger book, here it is. Here are things that God says in the book of Genesis, Deuteronomy, Joshua, 1 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Psalms, Isaiah, Matthew and Revelation, from beginning to end. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. The Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. May he never leave us or forsake us. The Lord is with you when you are with him. If we seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake you. Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Jesus said that. Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. That's at the end of Revelation, the last book of the Bible. God wants to be with us. He loves us. He tells us all the way through the Bible that that's what he wants to do and what he wants us to be. And so he leads them into the land, and he gives them the land. And yes, after 3-4 generations, 300 or 400 years of patience at least with the people who were living in the land that they went into, it was time. Things had got bad enough, and we will discover a little later on why they were ripe to be punished in this way. They sacrificed their own children by burning to the gods that they worshipped. They sexually exploited men, young men and women. Their life had become appalling, and so God used his people while he gave them this land to destroy them finally and drive them out. So his judgment came. He's a God of love, but he won't stand for terrible behaviour that destroys human beings. So God settled his people in the land that he'd promised to Abraham all those years before. He did it through the leadership of Joshua. And when Joshua became an old man and died, something happened very typical of human beings, even when they've been helped so dramatically by God. And at the end of the book of Joshua, we hear this. After these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance, at Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Here it is. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. Yes, they served the Lord during that time, as long as people remembered what God had done. But after that, all went pear-shaped again. And that's what the next book, the book of Judges, tells us all about. They were living, the people, as a nation at last, in their own land. And over the years that followed Joshua's life, the surrounding nations harassed them, and they had to be protected. And God raised up leaders for them to resist their enemies around them. But those judges became worse and worse people. Why we tell the stories of some of the judges, like Samson, one of the last. Samson was a terrible man. But the quality of people's living and the quality of their relationship with God was plummeting, as it has done so often. It's going down pear-shaped again. And in Judges, it starts to say towards the end of Judges, in those days Israel had no king. And in those days, beginning in chapter 19, Israel had no king. And at the end of the book of Judges, it tells us this. It tells us that in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And the national life had become like the life of the people who God had driven out ahead of them to give them this land. Yes, they were worshipping other gods, sacrificing their children. It was dreadful. But the last book we're going to look at in this video is the book of Ruth, which follows Judges, because in the middle of this terrible national life, led by these awful leaders, but they were the best God could get, there's the story of a woman called Ruth. She had married. She was one of those people, actually, who were from the peoples who had been in the land before. But she'd married a Jewish man, and he died, and her brothers had died, and she was left with her mother-in-law. But what she had seen in their life as followers of the one true God made her want to stay with her family and go back to Israel, because they'd been outside of Israel. She came back, and they were destitute, this little family. This is a little beacon of light in the middle of the darkness of the time of the Judges. And they came back, and of course they had to get back into the life of God's people. And she met a man called Boaz, who it turned out was their closest relative, the closest relative of her mother-in-law in Israel. They ended up being married, and Boaz rescued them from their poverty. And there's a wonderful surprise ending to the book of Ruth, because at the end of the book of Ruth, it tells us this. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He was a good man, Boaz. He was a man of integrity in amongst all this terrible community life. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, her mother-in-law, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a helper. May he become famous throughout Israel. May Boaz become famous, and this child become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to this child." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women lived there. They said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David, King David. God blessed this little family, which was a gleam of light in the darkness of the time of the Judges. And this family, their grandson was King David. And that's what a huge amount of the rest of the Old Testament is all about, the life and times of David. That's where we're going to leave it till the next video, where we move on. If you'd like to read more about these books that we've looked at, you can get my little booklet, Sprinting and Jogging with Jesus, First Steps on a Pathway into the Bible. Or you can buy the big book, which is called A Pathway into the Bible, Walking with God, Then and Now. It's in there as well. So, I'll speak to you again.